to next speaker, we have very interesting talk. I would say we have Nick Roy with us. Nick Roy is actually working with Splunk. He's a sort of security specialist in Splunk. And he is going to discuss today open source intelligence and the Hermit Kingdom, leveraging online sources to learn more about the world's most secret nation. So let's see what Nick tells about the world's most secret nation. So, and yep, again, post your questions to Discord if you have any to Nick. Hand over to Nick to you.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Good morning, everyone. So my name is Nick Roy, and my talk is OSINT in the Hermit Kingdom, learning more about the world's most secretive. So we'll jump right into it. I know we have about 45 minutes, so we'll save some of the introduction slides for later. But if you're not familiar with open source intelligence and what it is, essentially it's data collected from publicly available sources that we're going to use in an intelligence context. In our case, it's going to refer to anything that's publicly accessible. It's not related to any kind of open source software or collective intelligence. There's certainly plenty of paid sources you can use. But today we're really just going to be looking at what's free and what can be found from the comfort of sitting on our couch at home. So why is open source intelligence important? What can it be used for? If we think about a couple of different perspectives, red team, when we start scanning an attack surface, we want to start identifying various systems and services. We want to look for any kind of leaked information, credentials that we can find, that employees might be posting on LinkedIn or other sites that we may not want them posting some of that information. Blue team, obviously we want to find all of that before someone else finds it. We can use this in our monitoring, our alerting. We can use it for enriching our alerts, our threat hunting. So there's a lot of good ways that we can use this data. And we'll take a look at some of that today, some of the various sources, as well as some other kind of different sources that we may not always think about. So what are some of the benefits of using open source intelligence? It is less risky, especially in my case, and if we're doing some research. We're not going out and actively probing any of these systems. Really, we're just relying on information that we can find publicly on the internet. We're doing some clever Google searches. We're looking on social media. It is pretty cost effective. I think I've been working on this for about 3-4 years now. I've spent maybe $1,000. So it is pretty easy to gather all this information. And I am certainly not a lawyer in any way, but essentially everything that we're looking for is already available. It's already published, it's already online. So it's really just a matter of finding this information and being able to interpret it. So while that all sounds well and good, there are some challenges that we run into as well. One of the biggest problems I face all the time is just there is a lot of data out there. This was a great screenshot that I found, some of the various sources that we can use. There is a lot of data out there, and reliability is always a problem, especially if it's things that are just published on the internet. We want to try to validate our data as much as we can. And one of the biggest challenges is having to manually review a lot of this data, especially in my case. When I started working on this a couple of years ago, I really didn't know what I was looking, which makes it sort of challenging because I really didn't know where things would lead me to. So I spent a lot of time on things that really just didn't have any value or really have anything good in there. So there's a lot of time spent just reviewing this data to make sure that we're getting quality data and information that we can use. So why North Korea? A couple of years ago, it just started out an interesting idea. There's it's called the Vice Guide to North Korea. It's on YouTube. And they looked at it from a perspective of kind of the day-to-day citizen. They went on a tour of North Korea. And that was kind of what made me interested. And someone said, oh, I wonder if there's anything online in North Korea. And I said, oh, I actually have no idea. And it led me down this rabbit hole that 4 years later, I get to talk about some of the things that I found. I've met some interesting people along the way as I've been doing this. But it really started out as kind of a couple of questions that's asked. And 3-4 years later, a lot more information than I ever thought I'd put together on something outside of maybe the 6th grade for some book reports. So let's get right into it. When we start to think about open source intelligence and ways we can start to gather this data and what we want to start looking for, the first thing that we want to start to do is we want to start to identify what are systems and start to identify these various assets. There's a couple of ways that we're going to start gathering this information. We're going to use passive intelligence, which is what we're going to focus most of our time on today. But we can do things that are semi-passive. So maybe where I'm using something like the website built with, where it's going to go and crawl a website and tell us all the technologies and fun JavaScript libraries that are being used on a website. Where again, we're not actually browsing to these sites and other services to gather this data for us. And then we can do full-on active gathering. This is what we're trying to avoid. We don't want to be just running our Nmap scan. This is very loud. This is very noisy. We want to try to gather as much information as possible without ever actually probing any of these systems. And what do we want to find? We want to start to identify any kind of internet-facing systems, what kind of software and on them. Can we find any kind of cloud systems that are associated with these domains, any kind of operating systems? Really starting to just build out a scope for what we want to identify and further investigate. So the first question that I got asked a long time ago, is North Korea online anywhere? This is actually a pretty easy question to answer. There is a that covers the IP address range that's assigned to North Korea. They have 4 Class C networks on this subnet here. So it's off to a good start, pretty easy to find this. There are a couple of other subnets that North Korea is associated with. In the last 3-4 years, I've talked to a couple other people about this also. There's never really been any activity there to really get a good idea of what it's being used for. So in our case, we're just going to focus on these this /22, 176 to 179, and see what we can find in there. Now, what do we do if we don't have a Wikipedia article? This is always the question of the day. As much as Wikipedia makes everything easier, sometimes we have to start doing a little bit of research on our own to figure out exactly what's in scope. So if we look at something like .com, you can use something as simple as the dig command. This will tell us not only the IP addresses that are resolving, but it gives us some other information here, the AS number. And this is how we start to resolve IP addresses to the organization that owns them. So I can see apple.com has an AS number of 714. I can look that up online. I can see the almost 50 million IP addresses that Apple owns and is responsible for. Now we want to make sure that we are validating our data. While Wikipedia is a great source of information, certainly there are people who have changed it to win bets. So we can do the same thing. We can run the dig command. We can find the AS number for that block of IP addresses. In this case, it's 131.279. If we look that up online, we can see that, yes, 4 Class C networks are assigned to North Korea for their usage. So now we have an idea of where we're starting. We've sort of narrowed down our scope a little bit here from the entire internet to 4 Class C networks. The next thing we want to start to do is we want to start to identify what kind of devices are available, what kind of services are running. Out of those 1,024 IP addresses, how many of them are actually online? So we started doing some Google searching, wanted to see how far back could I find this information? Is this something that anyone else has looked into? And what I found was this was a website that someone had published back in November of 2010. They ran an Nmap scan against North Korea, and they found that there were 13 servers online at the time. There were a couple of web server, but there wasn't too much else that was online at the time. So if we fast forward to today, One of the things we also want to see is how have things changed over time. This is just something that I'm always interested in knowing. How many more servers have come online? Have they grown at certain points? One of my favorite websites is GitHub, not only because I like using it for backing up all of my code there, even though real development purposes, but the other thing you can do is you can find a lot of interesting things that people are committing to GitHub, whether that's on purpose or not. We'll talk more about GitHub in a little bit, some of the things you can find on there. But in my case, I started searching GitHub for North Korea, and I found that people are constantly scanning North Korea and publishing their scans for anyone to view. This makes my life easier. Now I don't have to ever run a scan. Information that we're looking for. Again, if we start to look in some other different sources, we might be able to find a lot online. And truthfully, one of my favorite reasons, there's always things that people are accidentally committing to GitHub. Again, we'll talk more about it in a little bit, some of the other interesting things you can find on there. But again, when we start thinking about open source intelligence, it doesn't always have to be just these traditional threat feeds that we're used to thinking about. Different sites out there that we can use, especially if they're making data publicly accessible, that we can really search through and get creative with trying to find little pieces of information that we can use later on as we're doing more in-depth research. So we can look on GitHub. We can also look in some other places as well. I'm sure everyone is familiar with website Showdown. If you're not, it's an internet-wide scanning site. It's always constantly scanning the internet. You can query this. You can find devices. You can find services running on here. So we turn to Showdown next. We have our GitHub results. But again, we want to remember, we want to verify our data. It is just posted online. So we want to make sure that we can at least verify and validate this information. Showdown starting point. You can always find interesting things on here as well. But in our case, we can start to reference this data against our Nmap scans. And we can use other internet-wide scanning service as well. Census is another one that we can use. They didn't have as many results as Showdown, but again, it gives us another source of reference that we can use to start to get an idea for exactly how many of these IP addresses are live and start to focus down further on what we want to research. So we'll skip ahead. We won't go through all of the results and talk about piecing everything together. But back in November 2010, there were 12 servers online in the North Korean IP address space. Today, there's anywhere between 30 and 35 servers online at any given time. When I was putting this together, 3 servers online. It does fluctuate a little bit, but it's typically anywhere between 30 and 35 servers, up from the 13 back in November 2010. So we've started to narrow this down a little bit. We identified where we can start to look online. We've started to identify what kind of devices are active. A little bit better of an idea of what exactly is on these devices. So this is one of the only times we're going to actually go and start looking at some of these devices. One of my favorite things is just pulling up a web browser, seeing what happens if I try to connect to them. And in this instance, we can see a couple of things here. Connecting on port 80, we have the IP address. We know that this is an Apache web server. Something interesting here. If we look at this, typically we would see Red Hat, CentOS, some version of Linux. But in our case, we see Red Star 4.0 here. This is where we start to take a little bit of a detour on some other things. But this is where we start to learn some more interesting things about really how these websites are built and running inside North Korea. So if you are not familiar with the Red Star It's a sponsored operating system developed in North Korea. It's a fork of CentOS. You can find it online. It has been made available. And there's a couple of things that some researchers have found on there that are pretty interesting as they've started to dig into this more. Two of them in particular is this SCN PRC binary. So this scanner, if you create a file, it'll start to scan every file that gets created, and it's going to look for various strings in that text. We can see some of them here. If it matches anything in that file is automatically deleted. There's also the OPPRC process that's running in the background. What this is going to do is it actually watermarks files on the operating system. So if I share it with someone else, they share it with someone else who also make changes, you can establish a chain of custody for who made each change on that document. And this works across a number of files and formats that get created when being created on the Red Star operating system. So there are some great GitHub repos. These were one of the researchers out of Germany, where they published a lot of the scripts that they use. Some more information is available there. And if you're not familiar with what the operating system looks like, this was version 1 of Red Star. Has that nice Windows XP theme that I think we all miss. Version 2, we move a little bit more into the kind of traditional Linux interface. This is where it takes a pretty radical change. Really looks like a Mac OS now. The interesting thing was around this time is when we also started seeing in pictures, they started seeing more Mac desktops inside of North Korea. So starting to mimic that interface as well. Now we do know version 4 is available. North Korea publishes guides once a quarter about their economy and what their factories are producing. There are articles about it. It is available to purchase inside the country. It has not made its way online yet, but there is evidence that it does exist, and it is something that is being actively maintained. Now, a lot of this is for the quote-unquote home version of the Red Star operating system. There's also the server version of Red Star OS. And since the work done on the home version, I really started digging into the server version more. I do have this running at my house. It's a lot of, not as much on there as the home version, but there are a couple of tools on there and some interesting things that I found so far as I've started to dig into this. There's 3 applications on there: Beam and RSSmon. We'll take a look at some of those, but those are used for the server. SE Tools is a nice graphical interface for managing SE Linux. Yum is disabled by default on Red Star server. There was really no kind of evidence that I could find that they're using any of their own internal repos. It's all just disabled on the operating system. And one of the most interesting and frustrating things was that it runs as root, but when you're lacking certain privileges. And that was one of the things that I had to try to figure out right away. I was logged in as the root user, but as I started just looking around the file system, I started getting a lot of permission denied errors. There were certain directories that I was locked out of. So I was talking to a friend of mine, and he told me that this is using, it's called the Bell-LaPadula model of enforcement control. And if you're familiar with this, because I certainly wasn't, this is apparently really only used by the DoD. It essentially sets various permission levels. So even though you're the root user, you still may be denied access to certain files. So this is where I was running into different pop-ups. I was running into permission denied as I was starting to look at this more. So we had to figure out a way. What can we do? So we turned back to Google. You start to Google thing, Red Star, you get all sorts of good information. But one of the things I noticed was there were some Russian articles posted about Red Star. And I actually Googled the Red Star translation, which is posted there. I Googled that. That took me to a couple of Russian forums, and I found that there were users posting all of the manuals online for the Red Star operating system. It was a slow process. It did take a lot of Google Translate, but eventually I got to the page where it shows exactly how to change your permissions on the operating system, how you can elevate to exactly what you need. So at that point, I was able to escalate, and now I could start to really install. I could start to look at some of the files that were created on there. The interesting thing was, as I've been slowly working my way through all 4 versions of these manuals, they do have benchmarks published in there similar to things like the CIS benchmarks and various hardening standards that you can use to harden your Red Star server if you're deploying it in production. So they seem to be very aware of not only what kind of services are running on there, but being able to secure them as well before they're deployed to the internet. So now that I had access to everything, finally, I could start to look at some of the Perl scripts that were on there. I could really start to dig into some of the files and see what was on here. There's still a lot more to read through, but some of the messages were interesting. There is some debate on using dev random versus dev view random. North Korean developers, these differences, apparently, we can see where they generate a random number twice. They check to see if it is equal, which I thought was interesting. Some other things that are interesting on there, they do have their own security built in. So we might all be familiar with something like fail to block, where if I have someone who tries to log in over SSH a number of times and they're unsuccessful, we'll automatically block their IP address. North Korea has built their own, where they have their own block lists that get created automatically after a certain amount of unsuccessful login attempts. So there's still more to go through there. There's a lot more scripts on there that I've slowly been working my way through. But the other thing that I could do now is I could also start to install and look through some of these other programs on here. So this is looking at the Beam program, as it's called. So once I was figure that, now I have my nice graphical interface here for managing my server. And again, I thought this was pretty interesting. All of my services that I would need to deploy, no more command line installation, no more config files to deal with. Everything for the server is managed through this graphical interface that they've built on top of it. So we can manage all of our users on here, our services, network configuration. Everything is available through these Beam and these RSS Mon programs to make it easier to manage the Red Star deployments. So it was a little bit of a detour there, but as we start to dig into it more, there's certainly more detours to take. But we've identified at least some of the infrastructure. We've gone from a couple of Class C networks. We've identified what kind of devices are on there. The other thing we want to do is we want to see if we can find any domains. Because now what I can do is once I've identified all of these domains, I can start to look for maybe subdomains that have been forgotten. Those are also really good, really easy ways to get some bug bounty points a lot of times. We can find domains that maybe have been forgotten, domains that are pointing outside of those IP addresses that we saw before. Now, one of the things we do know, North Korea, this was about 6 years ago. North Korea has 28 websites registered to its domain. Their official top-level domain is .kp. The reason we know this is at the time, someone noticed that North Korea was allowing global zone transfers on their DNS. So they were able to enumerate all of the websites in North Korea. And at the time, there were 28 websites on. So since that day, myself and a couple of other people have kept an eye on some of the websites using various services. We're up to 33 different domains. This points to 31 individual websites. There's a couple of domains that are shared, pointing to the same website. But again, we want to identify as many as we can because we want to start to see what else is this pointing to. Maybe there's a certain IP range that we just don't know about. Maybe there's cloud services that this is resolving to. So we're going to start to use various passive DNS services where they're recording all of the DNS queries and responses. We can start to look at who is data, but we can start to map these domains back to infrastructure as well. Start to round out this picture that we're building. I don't have a picture of this, but the screenshot on the right is from the Air Koryo website. This is North Korea's state airline. If you look in non-COVID times when they have their flights running, every flight is always on time. This is another one we can easily verify. If we look at something like Flight Radar, on this day, I think a couple of these flights were actually delayed about 4 or 5 hours, but everything on their website always shows on time and perfect. But again, we want to make sure we validate our data as we're finding it across our various sources. So we have a good starting point, but what if we don't have this available? If we don't have that nice Wikipedia article telling us where to start looking? Again, we can start with just some of the basic information. Again, example, I can run my whois lookup. I can start to do my reverse DNS lookups to see what kind of domains are registered. I think last time I checked, Apple has something like 16,000 domains that it registers. But there are ways where we can start to use just some basic searches to see what kind of information is available. A lot of domains are registered with these various privacy services now, which does make this a little bit challenging. But this is where we can also start to use things like DNS data. There are services out there that are recording all of these DNS requests and responses. So we can query this, again, to start to find these domains, how they're mapping back to this infrastructure, to start to build out this picture of how many domains are online for a given organization. We can also get a little bit more creative with this. One of the things that we've started seeing come online recently is websites in North Korea using HTTPS. And a lot of times in the certificates, there's a lot of good metadata in there that we can use and search. One of the things we can do is we can look at the hash of that certificate, and we can actually search that using these internet scanning sites like Census to see, is this certificate being reused anywhere else? So another way where we can some additional information gathering. Again, in this case, when I started doing this, they only had one website with HTTPS. So there wasn't too much I could find, but it is something that I've started watching more as they are moving over to HTTPS for their websites to see how these certificates are being generated. We can see a lot of this is self-signed according to their various internal infrastructure. But again, it gives us a good way to get a little bit better an idea of what kind of sites are online. Are these certificates being reused anywhere? And then about a year ago, one of the websites that came online is DPSK Portal.kp. I'm always personally convinced that this website was put online just because this is a directory that essentially lists all of the websites in North Korea. So it's made my life a lot easier where I can any kind of new sites. But I'm also convinced that this was put online just to frustrate myself and a couple of other people that I talked to about this when we were watching all of this traffic for years and years. Now it's much easier to just go here and see if there's anything new online. So the last part of this, so we found our servers, we found our domains. What else can we find? We want to start. Again, this is where we can start to use these various internet scanning sites. One of the things we'll start to see to look at some of this North Korean infrastructure. A lot of the websites are all running on Red Star. Any of the actual infrastructure like DNS, mail servers, NTP servers, these are all actually running on either Red Hat or CentOS. You can see that in the banners that are being grabbed here. But we can also find some other interesting things. One day this popped up on, I believe this was on Census. There's a VMware server online for a little bit. There's a Cisco device online, which I believe this is still currently there. And again, we want to make sure that we are validating our data. So I can look across other internet scanning sites. I can verify that it is the same response, the same data being returned. Sure that we are, to the best of our ability, validating our data as much as we possibly can. So the grand total at the time when I put this all together, there were 5 web servers, a couple of DNS servers, mail servers, VNC server. There's about 20 services running on port 8080. I'm still not sure what those are. To this day, it's still big. And it's broken out across a number of Linux servers, Red Hat, Red Star. There's always a couple of Windows servers on there, typically running IIS with just the default pages in place always. And that Cisco device always seems to be online somewhere as well. And again, why is it important to identify these services? These are things that I want to know before someone else finds them. Again, some of these, if I start to look them up in the versions being returned, we can start to see that there are some possible vulnerabilities here. Again, it could just be something that was changed for the banner, but these are things that I want to know before someone outside my organization finds these and potentially exploits these. So we spent a lot of time talking about Korea's actual infrastructure and some different ways we can identify that. The other thing that I wanted to start to look at as well is, can we find any evidence of North Korea actually browsing on the internet as well? And the reason for this is there's essentially 2 versions of the internet in North Korea. There is a intranet, which is what most people have access to. It's really just for inside the country only. And then there is an official internet link, but this is for party elites, essentially, only having access to the outside internet. This is a picture that I found on Flickr from someone's tour of North Korea. This was in a computer center where they have a list of all of the sites on the intranet published on the right-hand side there. And it is varying how many sites there are. I've heard as little as 20 or 30, all the way up to 2,000 or 3,000 internally. That's pretty hard. But there are a couple of interesting ones that I've come across. These are things that don't resolve for me, but just digging into it a little bit more and asking around. There are some different domains that I've been able to find, especially for things that are used inside of hotels or kind of the social networking service that they have available. And this was another screenshot that was published as well for some of the various sites and apps that are used on the intranet as well. But really what started this was about 6 years ago. Maybe it was a little more now that this was published. Steam, the gaming service, published a map of where everyone in the world was connecting from. And I circled it there. It might be a little bit difficult to see. But one of the things that really interested me was there was one dot coming out of North Korea. So I wanted to see, what can I find? Again, using some various Google searches or Google dorks, if we want to call them. Just basic searches that I can do. Searching for various IP addresses. In this case, I was looking for any type of logs that Google has indexed. This was on a Russian oil website where I found a North Korean IP address that was browsing it. Pastebin, another great site to search. Leaked credentials I want to know about. This was a leak from a Minecraft server where we can find a username and in North Korea. And then we start to look at some of the other sources as well, things that we may not always consider. So this is where if we look at something like Wikipedia, for example, see that there are changes made by an IP address in North Korea for various articles. Since if we don't have an actual account, it logs the IP address. There were a number of changes made across various articles. And again, we can start to look at other sources. This is a website called I Know What You Download. It's essentially scanning all of the trackers for various torrent websites. You can query this. You can search this based off of your own IP address, based off of movies, countries. A lot of interesting information in there. I wrote a script that queried this for all of the North Korean IP addresses that were torrenting. These were the ones that were returned. Learned about popular movies that they're downloading. Sporting events is a popular one being torrented. But I thought this was interesting as well. These were all of the device drivers for, we can see cameras in there, graphics cards, that's various devices that were being torrented for these drivers. So we can start to find some activity of North Korea online. We can take a look at their infrastructure. Social media is always another popular one. This was an article about 2 years ago that came out that LinkedIn is the social media North Korea's elite. I still have not gotten a friend request on there. But there's a lot of things you can find on there very easily with some hashtags that I never thought would work. This was searching Instagram for hashtag visitor badge. We found all sorts of information that I had to blur out for doing this. Names, contact information, all sorts of information that you can find. Hashtag new job is another one that gets a little, has information that people are posting online. But what can we find out about North Korea from social media and from some of these other sources? This was from a tour group in North Korea. Mini kegs are being released soon by the official North Korean brewery. This is a pamphlet that they give you when you check into the hotel, how to cope with potential disaster. This is one of the guided tours, what's called the Palace of the Sun. This is interesting because when you're on the tour, you're not allowed to take any pictures in there. But we can see on Instagram, this is actually tagged on the map specifically as a location. Very easy to find all the pictures that people have been sneaking in there as well and posting online. And we talked about the Red Star operating system. While it does seem to be used for a lot of their websites that are deployed, as far as day-to-day usage, it doesn't seem to be that popular. A lot of the pictures that I've seen based off of what's been published across, again, people's tour groups and pictures released by North Korea across some of their social media presence. Everything appears to be Windows XP. It seems to be very active and alive there. As far as the Red Star home version, it doesn't seem to have really been used too much outside of just some of the colleges and again, we always want to make sure we're validating our data as much as possible. This was a picture that was published by the North Korea state media on one of the websites. It always looks a little too perfect, the weather. Everything looks a little too uniform. Again, these are pictures that we can verify. There's websites like Photo Forensics that will look at the various layers of an image and start to when they've been modified. You can do this with a lot of images that you find, but it's a great way where not only will it let you look at all of the metadata of a file, but it also quickly highlight things that might be a little bit suspect, and in our case where we start to see a little bit too much uniformity, start to confirm some of those suspicions for us. And then we can also start some outside sources as well, things that we may not consider. Strava, if you're not familiar with it, is a fitness band similar to a Fitbit or something like an Apple Watch. And one of the things they do is if you opt into it, they'll publish your anonymous data of where you've been. The idea being that it's going to help other people find hiking trails and bike paths. But I heard this and thought, oh, I wonder what I can find for if I look at North Korea. We thought there's probably not going to be anything there, but we can start to see if we zoom in. We can start to see various roads that are being highlighted that people have been traveling. A lot of this appears to be tour groups as they are going to North Korea. But if we zoom in even further, we can really get a good idea of some of these buildings that they're going in. We can probably get a good idea of exactly what these tour groups are doing, the routes that they're taking. Problem also for some military bases where people were wearing these. This information was being published online as well. So again, if we start to look at some other sources that we may not consider, there is a lot of interesting information that we can find out there. One of the things I also found, I noticed up north, there were a couple of very faint purple lines here, and I was curious to know what this was. So I took those coordinates and I put it into Google Maps. It's a ski resort. Now, the interesting thing about this, at least to me, was North Korea does have a ski resort. Might have actually seen pictures of it. It's been featured in a lot of places, but this is not the ski resort. This is something completely different on the Strava map. I've never actually seen pictures of it before, but again, it gives one more thing that I can start to look into further and see what else we can find based off of some of this data that's online. Now, a couple of other things as we start to wrap this up. Silla vaccine, this came out a couple of years ago, some research that Checkpoint did with a reporter, Martin Williams, who does some great work. This is essentially an antivirus that runs on North Korean computers. But if you start to, again, look up on GitHub, the Shadow Brokers leak a couple of years ago when they leaked all of those hacking tools. One of the things we find in there when we start to look up the Silla vaccine, we can see that in these tools that are leaked, where they're scanning on an endpoint to see if there's any kind of antivirus or EDR running, one of the things that they are checking for is actually this Silla vaccine program. So it is something that is well known, apparently. It is something that people are checking. And this was something that I thought was pretty interesting to find. And then one of the last things, as we do start to look in unusual places, one of the other hobbies I have is looking through all of the HTML for these websites. Sometimes I don't have the most interesting things to do during the day or at night, but I can start to see one of the things here, there's some various font families specified. I had never heard of these before. A little bit more research, I found out that these were fonts developed inside of North Korea. So I started searching those fonts a little bit more, the names. They've actually come up on a couple of sandboxes where you can submit services or files to detect if they're malicious. This was one in particular. I thought the comment was really great. No idea what it is. I found it on my laptop. Certainly this doesn't provide any attribution to a North Korea but I thought it was interesting looking at some of those font names and some of the results that were being returned as well. Something that I had never really considered until I saw that and started looking into it more. So I know we're almost at time here. There's all sorts of fun things we can find online. One of the things that I always like recommending, OSINTframework.com. It's a great website. I follow this all the time when I'm not sure where to go, of resources, and it's a nice tree structure that you can expand and collapse as you want to start doing investigations. It makes it easy to find all sorts of resources. And I have my own website, nkinternet.wordpress.com, that I've been publishing things on for the last number of years. So if you are interested in anything, I have probably 3-4 years worth of material published on there that doesn't fit in here all the time. But always try to keep it up to date possible. And that's about it. Thanks, thanks everyone.
Thank you, Nick. That was really good.